Thank you, everybody, as I say, for joining us today. This session, to make sure that you're in the right place, is knowledge-based approaches to supporting gender identity and exploration. And we're focusing very much on what best practice is for inclusive youth work. So today is going to really be about learning how to foster a person-centred and appreciative inquiry approach about working with young people, focusing very much on their needs and how we support them. So we're going to look at this through a variety of lenses. We're going to touch on things like intersectionality. We're going to touch on social prejudice and discrimination and some of the broader social challenges for young people. We're going to focus very much on what good looks like and how we can really start to think about what we can learn and what we can take to apply in the work that we do with young people. So this is very much about having an opportunity to connect into the insights from the panelists and the things that they might signpost and flag to you that you can take and link into your own toolkit of approaches and the work that you do. It's going to focus on creating inclusive environments. It's going to focus on how we ensure that the work that we do is led by the voices and experiences of young people. And it's really going to be about how we support trans and non-binary young people much more effectively in youth work environments. So I'm going to start with a bit of a health warning. What this isn't is a session to debate and discuss some of the national policy, health and social policy that we've seen in the news and in our work over the past year. So we're not focusing in on any of those really challenging and tricky topics, things like the CAS review that's very medicalised. This is very much about the work that we do every day with young people. So if you do have questions on things like that, we're probably not going to pick them up today, but feel free to pop them in, and if we can respond to them post the event, we will. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of blurb before we start. We've got lovely Karen and Zina in the background who are going to be monitoring the chat and the questions. So if, as we're going through, you hear things that you want to pick up on, or you have any questions specifically for our brilliant panelists, please do pop them in. And we always try and make time at the end to filter through some of those questions to give you the opportunity to have those answered. If we run out of time or there's too many questions, we'll try and collate them and we'll respond to them post the event in the email update that we send you, which will have links to and signposts to anything that our panelists have shared with you today. So research, resources, websites, that kind of stuff. So that's the plan. That's what we're going to do. But this is not really about me talking to you about the blurb. It's about the people that we've brought to you as panelists today who are experts in the field, who do this kind of work and work with young people around some of these identity-based topics on a daily basis. So without further ado, I'm going to do a quick round of introductions so you can get a bit of a sense of who's with us today before we move in. So I'm going to come to each of you in turn, panelists, and if you could just give us an introduction to you, who you are, and a little bit about you, your work, and what your interest or expertise is in this topic, if that's okay. So Ben, I'm going to come to you first, please, if that's okay.
Yeah, great. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I have this opportunity. So my name's Ben Dew. I use pronouns he, him, and I'm the training and education manager at an organisation called All Sorts Youth Project. I'll just say a bit about All Sorts in a moment, but similar to you, Abby, I've shockingly now 27 years working with children and young people. I was 19 when I got my first job, if you're trying to age me. And that's what I've done my whole career. I worked in children's homes, therapeutic communities in the first part of my career, in and around education for the sort of mid part. And I've been at All Sorts now for 14 years, which surprises me because I never thought I'd work anywhere that long. But there's a lot of work to do, so I'm going to keep going. I'm also a therapist by training, so I trained in humanistic therapy, qualified about 18 years ago. And although I don't do discrete counselling work, it very much informs, and that person-centred approach is very much the way I work and absolutely the way All Sorts works. And in brief, All Sorts, what we say we do is listen to, connect and support children and young people under the age of 26 who are LGBT+, but also importantly, those who are exploring their sexual orientation and or gender identity. And that notion of exploring is incredibly important to us because so many of our young people are exploring. We think that's healthy and great that they should do that. And we've been running for 25 years based we started in Brighton. We're now a pan-Sussex organisation, but we do lead training and education work more across the southeast, and indeed anywhere that will book us to do our training. So I'm very much looking forward to working with you all today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ben. Much of your career history really resonated with me, so I'll probably have a pick your brains conversation post this, but really useful to give us sort of like a geographical context for your work too, so that's helpful. So if there's anybody here that's on the webinar who's from across that region, definitely worth perhaps getting in touch with All Sorts and seeing what networks you can build and support that you can find. So thank you. Maud, I'm going to come to you next, please.
Hi everyone. Just pre-warning the joys of working from home. I've got some building work going on, so hopefully the news aren't too distracting. I am my pronouns are she, her, and I'm an LGBTQ plus youth worker with the BU project under the charity Porchlight. A little bit of background about me. I did a psychology degree and then a gender studies master's. And previously I was working as a learning mentor at a special needs school. And now I'm currently an LGBTQ plus youth worker. So the BU project works all across Kent and Medway, and we work on a one-to-one basis with young people from ages 8 to 25, but we also run youth groups as well. So we've got 6 youth workers that work across Kent and Medway, and we work with 8 young people on a one-to-one basis at any one time, as well as running 13 to 17-year-old youth groups, which are in person, and we also have an online 13 to 17, which is every other Friday. We have an adult online group from the ages of 18 to 25 that we run every week, and we also have a parent support group that we run every other Friday as well. We also do something called the BU Big Day Out in summer. So we host a big day as the project, where all the young people can come and have fun. We have sort of different stalls like badge making workshops and drag performances, and it's a fun day for all the young people to come to. And we like to organise lots of summer activities for our young people as well, just to keep them connected so that they can meet up with other young LGBTQ plus or questioning people, get support from the youth workers as well, but mainly to create a safe, welcoming space for young people. Yeah, it's a little bit about BU.
Thanks, Maud. So we've got Southeast represented there. I'm also really interested, the first thing that I noticed about both of you is that you're talking about the whole spectrum of transitionary youth work all the way up to age 25, which is hugely valuable, because what we know is that often young people reach almost like it's a metaphorical cliff edge, right, at 18, when you're not a young person and you're not an adult. So really fantastic that you both have been able to offer sort of that breadth of transitionary youth work. Yeah, that's really, really great. I wouldn't be surprised if people reach out to ask how you manage that and how you work those things through, but we can pick that up later. Thank you. Saba, over to you.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you for having me. My name is Saba. My pronouns are they or he. And my LGBTQ youth work journey actually started working with Ben at All Sorts Youth Project. Must be just about over 10 years ago now. So it's really amazing to be doing this with you, Ben, and to be here. Since All Sorts Youth Project, I've worked with gender intelligence for 10 years as a senior youth work practitioner, where I was leading the UK's only youth service for trans youth of colour, which was mostly based in London, but we also did national work as we worked online. At the moment, though, I'm the current co-founder and director of Colours Youth Network, which is an organisation who support LGBTQ, youth of colour, young people and youth workers across the UK, so running national events and online spaces as well. This summer we actually curated the very first Youth and Families stage at UK Black Pride, which was fantastic. I'm also a director of Middlesex Pride, which is a local pride event where we really centre young people in our programme. But in my spare time, which I'm trying to figure out how I fit that in, I do freelance consultancy, speaking like this, and training on inclusive practice within youth work, but also charity and corporate settings. I promise I'm almost done. I'm also sitting on the vice chair of trustees at Inclusive Mosque Initiative, so really bringing my identity as a Muslim into the work, as well as like you said, Ben, I'm also trained as a person-centered psychotherapist, so that definitely feeds in my approach. And lastly, I'm also an author of Supporting Trans People of Colour, How to Make Your Practice Inclusive. And the most important thing is I live in West London with my foster cats. That's it.
Ah. So between the building work and your cats might make an appearance and my dog might make an appearance, we're really creating a safe and inclusive space for all of the things that we have going on in the background there. Fantastic. Saba, it was really interesting as well to kind of build another connection, not only between you and Ben's work, but also your work and Maud's work. Both talked about digital spaces and being able to connect with young people online. And when we talk about places and spaces for work, we'll definitely be coming back to that. Quite timely, given that the sort of the Safer Phones bill is being read tomorrow, and the relationship between digital spaces and schools and accessibility for young people. It's quite timely to think about some of that stuff, so we'll definitely come back to that. Lucy, can I come to you, please?
Yep, sure. Hi, I'm Lucy Jones, and I'm not a youth worker. I'm the interloper here today. So yeah, I'm Lucy, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm an academic at the University of Nottingham, and my research is in LGBTQ plus youth, specifically focusing on how language is used by young people to communicate their identities and their experiences. As I say, I'm not a youth worker, but all of my research has been based within youth groups, within LGBTQ plus youth groups. So I've spent quite a lot of time working with young people on that basis, kind of getting to know them, sort of working as a participant observer in youth group settings before conducting interviews with young people. And as well as that, I'm a trustee at the LGBTQ plus youth charity Say It in Sheffield. So I think all of that's given me some insight, which hopefully will be useful today. I've learned a lot about the amazing work that youth workers do. And the other thing I've been doing quite recently is producing resources with young LGBTQ people for use outside of academia in the broader sphere. So there's some policy impact work there. We produced the LGBT plus youth manifesto, which was a social media campaign where young people talked about what they think needs to happen and change to make life better for them. And that included some policy work with MPs and policymakers. And most recently, we've produced this, which is a glossary of LGBTQ plus language, again written by young people themselves, and we're disseminating that really widely. So if anybody here would like some copies, you can just let me know and I'll get them sent out to you. But yeah, really looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Lucy. I have absolutely no doubt that you're probably going to be inundated. We'll try and filter some of those requests for you. I think it's really interesting that you contextualise yourself as not a youth worker, because clearly you're an academic, but actually everything that you described there was about being present with young people and providing spaces for young people to advocate on their own behalf and lobbying for things that young people want. So perhaps not a youth worker by title, but sounds very much that it's like a bit of a values and pedagogy piece for you. And I think
in my heart.
It's in your heart, which is where youth work lives for all of us, right? I also think one of the things that we really try and do with these sessions is connect theory to practice. And so we always try and ensure that we have somebody with a really strong academic background like yourself in these sessions, because that's the way that we learn and we shape and we grow as practitioners, right? Is that continuing commitment to ongoing development. So we're really, really grateful for you for making time to be here with us today. And actually, you are going to be the first person that I come to with some questions. So you've probably got just enough time to sip a bit of water before I come back at you. So we've heard from the panel. You've got a bit of a sense. We've got people with a more southern representation in terms of where they're located in England, with Lucy obviously repping Sheffield, so we've got a bit more northern or central to eastern. And also you can hear that we've got a real breadth of experience from academia to practice, through support for practitioners as well as families and across the whole breadth. So I think we're going to have a real richness to our conversations. I'm really excited to see what comes out. Just like our other sessions, we kind of operate thematically. So we're going to start to begin with really focusing on some real macro points. So we're going to be thinking about community and society and settings for young people. And we're going to start thinking about that in relationship to young people who are on a gender exploration journey, because I think, apologies, but somebody made the point about some young people are on a journey. They're not there yet. They don't really know what their identity is. And that feels like a really fundamental part of what we're going to talk about today. But even within that, there's some words that kind of might be a bit ambiguous, might not really mean the same thing to everybody. So, which is why I'm going to come back to you, Lucy, actually, because I think it'd be really useful for us to start with some definitions. We don't know where people are at and where people's understanding is. And obviously your research was working with young people to talk about their own definitions. So could you talk to us a little bit about your research, about the power of language, and why this is particularly important for LGBTQ plus young people?
Yeah, sure. And absolutely, I can kind of share some definitions provided by the young people I've worked with as well, if that's helpful. But kind of talking more broadly, you know, why is language important? I mean, language is important for all of us. It's a really key way, I think, for us to show our affiliation with other people that are like us. So we all use particular words or phrases that allow us to signal a shared sense of identity or experience that we share with others. We all do this. Everyone here will probably have particular jargon that they use with colleagues. You might have particular nicknames or in-jokes that you have with particular groups of friends. And when you use that language, you're signaling your shared sense of self. You're showing what you've got in common, and you're foregrounding the fact that you've got this thing in common and that you mean something to each other. And that's absolutely true for LGBTQ plus youth as well. It's particularly important for any marginalised group. I think when you've got people who are facing exclusion, marginalisation, bullying, it's really important to be able to use language in a way that's validating, that kind of allows you to show solidarity with other people like you, so that even if other people are kind of positioning you as weird or other, you can say, actually, no, this is who we are and we're proud of who we are. So I would say a really important thing about language actually is where we reclaim words that have been used as slurs in the past. Words like queer and dyke are often used by people as an in-group term. Young people that I've worked with tend to see the word queer very favourably, but not everybody feels like that, particularly I think older generations who've had it used against them. You know, for young people, I don't need to tell anyone here, words like gay can be used as a slur against them. So I think being able to embrace that language and use it positively to say, actually, this is who we are and we're proud of who we are. It makes things like labels very important to be able to distinguish who you are and sometimes categorize who you are. That can be really important when you're kind of working things out, particularly at a younger age. But generally, using language in shared ways, which can be fun as well, is really important, I think, to a shared sense of identity.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important, the stuff that the key things that jumped out to me that you talked about there was about signalling a shared sense of identity and the validation that can bring, which felt really important. And I'm really conscious that I deliberately don't put pronouns in my identity, and yet if we look around this room, everybody else has got that. Right now, I feel the outsider, right? So because the shared language of having that label is shared by everybody else on this Zoom screen apart from me. And I guess what you're talking about is exactly that experience when you've been othered, when you've been put outside of what's considered normative, being able to use things like language as a way to signal, hey, this is something that I'm proud of, and this is something that connects me and that we can share collaboratively is a really important part of our work with young people. So I was interested as well in what you said about the way that language changes and evolves, and how we can reclaim some language, but also, I guess what I heard you say was that not every word means the same thing to everybody. And I wonder if there's anything that came out of your research or your work with young people in relation to that that would be useful for some of our audience.
Yeah, sure. I suppose the first thing to say is that in this glossary project that we've done, the sort of target audience of that is adults who work with young people who already want to be allies, but perhaps are kind of worried about saying the wrong thing. So probably a lot of the people in this room might identify with that. And in that sense, we haven't included every single slang term or every single identity marker that anybody in the LGBTQ plus community uses. Instead, they're sort of terms that were agreed across the 4 different groups that I've worked with, and can sort of, I think, have a general, a broad agreement. So identity labels like asexual, pansexual, gender fluid, for example, they're in there. But there are some which struck me actually as interesting from a linguistic perspective. So the word gay, for example. So I'm a gay woman in my 40s, and I use gay to mean essentially homosexual, kind of lesbian. I tend to use the word gay, and that's always struck me as a specific identity label for a person who is attracted to the same sex. But across all of the groups that I've worked with, young people seem to be using gay much more as an umbrella term. So you might identify as trans and straight and still refer to yourself as gay in that context, because it really means, it's how I might use queer. It's used much more as an umbrella term to kind of mean anybody who is part of this community, who's part of this group, who's not cis, who's not straight. And I just find that really interesting. It shows that kind of language is dynamic, it changes, it evolves. That makes it difficult to keep track of. But it's also one of the wonderful things about language. And that's why, yes, you can make a glossary like this, but it will be out of date pretty soon. So we have to keep talking to young people, and we have to try and keep in touch with how they use language to talk about themselves.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful, isn't it? Like, language is something that changes and evolves all the time. I've got teenage children. I do not have a clue what they're talking about most of the time. And when I finally catch up with the words that they're using, I am then really embarrassing because I'm way out of date, right? But your point at the end was the one that was so hugely valuable, which is about their conversation starters. And it's how we use things like that glossary and that language to talk to the group of young people or the individual young people that we're working with, to find out like what's meaningful language for them, what's useful and inclusive language for them, rather than assuming as the adult in the room perhaps that we might know. I think I'd quite like to speak to you here, Saba, actually, because I think I know that you're particularly passionate about language, and you already flashed your book. I was going to pull it off my bookshelf. If not, it's there. I'll get it out later. But when I was reading your book, I was really interested. You wrote a little bit about like spaces and free speech and censorship, and and the relationship between that and this work. I just wondered if you can talk a little bit to that in the context of society and why that really matters for this particular group of young people.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you so much, Lucy, for starting off with like language and definitions. It's like the thing that I dread doing in trainings the most, because it's just so changing, it's so fluid, and I just the moment you kind of define a word, it's already out of date, which is like the beauty of language. But yeah, I really appreciate that you've done this resource. So yeah, please send me a copy. So yeah, I spoke a little bit about language in my book. This came under the section of creating a safer space, and I use safer just to really make us think that there's no such thing as a truly safe space. And I'm sure many of us on the call will have used things like safe space policies, safe space agreements, working agreements, group agreements, to really make young people feel safe in our spaces, to make them feel like they know what to expect from the space, and ultimately to protect them as well. And where this kind of fits in with the kind of wider society conversations is that people say that this prevents free speech. This censors people from saying what they want to say, from silencing them, creating the kind of echo chamber or a bubble, which ultimately, what people think is that it causes more harm than good. And some people say that there's no point doing it because you can't protect young people from what happens outside. You know, people are going to get triggered outside. You can't censor everything in the outside world. So it's like a, you know, like a false idea that you know these young people are safe, or that these that this policy includes people with different or opposing opinions. But the nuance around this, and the thing to really be noted about, is care, is the care that's involved. You know, there's a difference between censorship that is with care and censorship that is without care. And to really highlight this, I guess I'll kind of just ask, you know, well, why do we need safe spaces and these so-called echo chambers or bubbles in the first place? Well, for all of us, and many trans young people, we navigate many spaces in our lives that are not safe. And that bubble might be the one place that is safer than the rest. So for that trans young person coming into that group, this might be the only place that they're free from the threat of harm, abuse, harassment that they face in their daily lives. So really that safe space, that safe youth group then serves as a function to imagine a world without that harm, without that transphobia or racism, or at least where measures are taken by responsible adults to prevent those oppressions, you know, where actions are taken with care, where the safety of that trans young person and trans young people is centered and prioritized in that space. So safe spaces are held with care then, and they serve as a function, and that is what needs to be protected. And when it comes to creating those safe spaces, I'll just throw out a few questions that might be helpful to consider. Is to really question your own intentions within that. So, okay, we want to say there's no transphobia, there's no this, there's no that. What's our intention when censoring that? Is there a way that we can encourage more speech instead of less speech? You know, really bring in the educational kind of role of our position. Are there any alternative actions that we can take instead of silencing views that we disagree with? You know, what can we model, like really kind of almost transformative justice and radical practice? And then what does a space look like that is safe to disagree within look like? So yeah, those are just a few of my thoughts on that, Abby. Hope that's a good way to kick things off.
Yeah, I think it's the really powerful thing was when you first started talking about care, was I wrote down intentionality, and then you brought that out, and I think that's a really powerful message for people to take away, is like, why are you creating what you're trying to create? Why are you setting up those environments? Why are you doing those things? Because that intentionality makes a real difference. I think that's really useful for people, because one of the things that we hear frequently, so when Zaina and I are responding to queries from the sector, is things like, am I allowed to do specific sort of like issue or identity based groups? Is that inclusive? Is that oppressive in its own right? And I think what we're hearing really clearly from what you describe is that absolutely not, that intentional care and due regard and safety is really paramount, and is the only way to ensure real inclusive practice for all young people. I think there's some really, really solid points to come back to on that are really valuable. I particularly liked the point that you made about echo chambers and how they're not necessarily a negative thing, and what you described was actually that can be a really beautiful and validating and protective factor for young people who are experiencing horrible experiences and prejudice and discriminatory behaviour in lots of other aspects of their life. So yeah, I think that's something for me to take away. I think particularly I've definitely taken something from that. I think the echo chambers bit brings us quite nicely onto some of this different contexts for youth work, and we often talk about echo chambers and we talk about sort of like digital environments and as opposed to in real life environments. And I think Maud, I'd quite like to bring you in here, because I know you did some quite interesting stuff during COVID and some research with young people during COVID that I think we'll touch on some of that. So could you talk to us a bit about that research and what you learned from that perhaps will be really helpful for youth workers in their own practice?
Yeah, for sure. So during my master's, my dissertation, my research project, was looking at how isolation during pandemic impacted gender and sexual minority identity development. I mean, obviously, as a whole, the pandemic was a negative thing, and there would have been lots of negative implications for young LGBTQ plus people, such as isolating at home with potentially unsupportive or discriminatory family, you know, and being away from maybe the in-person support groups and youth workers that they may have had prior. And how, you know, people had to navigate that. But my research that I tried to do was look at like a positive side of COVID. So I was looking at those who weren't necessarily identifying as LGBTQ plus before, but how actually there was an impact of isolation and having that alone time in lockdown that actually led to a lot of sort of self-realizations and self-reflections about identity. And some of the main things I found was that that increased time and space to experience that self-reflection and sort of self-acceptance and also self-actualization, this sort of psychological phenomenon of, you know, sort of self-fulfillment in your identity, was really important. And also the safe space away from heteronormative society and sort of that judgment allowed people to sort of experiment with their self-presentation and their queer expression, which was a really important thing. And finally, as well, social media and online, how important that was. That you know, they've found that it's important for LGBTQ plus people, especially young people, education through sort of academic routes, and education is important, but actually also real life experience and validation through seeing people that have had their own journeys, you know, identifying with people with those labels and their experiences is just as important for people sort of on their own journey, because it's that validation. And so yeah, I looked at social media, in particular sort of TikTok was such a big thing during COVID that people found like they could relate. And we still see that now with social media, you know, like you said, young people are really in sort of the social world now, like online space. And there are obviously positives and negatives to it. I think some of the positives that young LGBTQ people find is that sense of anonymity and being able to be on an online space and not be perceived, compared to when they're in public in the world in heteronormative society and they're being perceived maybe in a negative light that they don't want to be. So being able to be online and not be perceived, or actually create an online space where they're being perceived how they would like to be perceived with, you know, the content they're sharing and uploading and things like that. And also just, you know, access to information, like with the TikTok, validation and access to other people online is really important. But you know, we found at BU that obviously during COVID, it was actually really hard to reach out to those young people in, you know, in cases where they were potentially living at home in dangerous situations. We had to be careful with how we were contacting people, you know, if family members were going to see what we sent them and stuff like that. So, and then afterwards there was a drop in, you know, clients, and people ended up being more homeschooled after that as well. So that also affected our youth work. I think we had in 2021 and 2022, we had sort of 2 people that are homeschooled. And then from 2023 to 2024, we then had 9 people that are homeschooled. And obviously that's increasing even more, which then impacted how we worked with those young people. So we tried to sort of change what we're doing to suit those young people where they feel comfortable, whether that's we go visit them at home, whether they prefer online one-to-one sessions or online groups, whether we meet them in an office building or a cafe, things like that. So really having to adapt how we support the young people is important for sure.
Yeah, I mean, there was so much in that, Maud. Thank you. I'm just trying to pick out the threads to take through. So the first thing that I thought was really interesting was when you talked about that like that self-realization and that self-presentation and young people being protected from those harmful external environments by COVID, ostensibly a negative, but how that enabled them to be free from those harms to really explore. And I think that really connects into what Saba was talking about places and spaces and like intentionality of what we create and how those bubbles are really important. I guess there's something interesting in what you said then about, and what's our role of youth workers to create and facilitate that both in the real world, and maybe that's not the right phrase, but in real life, in person context, but also in digital context, because actually, as you said, young people are increasingly operating across both, and there's definitely something about our skill set there. I also thought there was something really interesting that you said about safe access for young people, because in COVID more generally we had that challenge. Young people were isolated at home, therefore how they were able to access support was limited, and that brought risk. And I guess what I heard you say was particularly for LGBTQ young people who might not be living with supportive and safe guardians, there's an increased risk for them with how we as practitioners and as services engage with young people. I think there's something really interesting there, and I think there's definitely something for organisations and people to learn about that, because we might assume a one-size-fits-all approach. This is our organisational policy. This is how we contact young people who we've not seen for a while. But actually what you're talking about is something that could actually put young people at risk and put some young people at risk of harm. And I think there's some really interesting learning to do there. And then we'll come back to the social media one, because there's, it's wonderful. Excuse me, I've got a rude dog who just wants letting out of the room, just doesn't respect the fact that we're in the middle of a webinar. Ben, I'd really like to come to you on this, because I think what we heard from Maud there was a breadth of things actually, but for me there's something about very specific skills, knowledge and expertise that might be needed in order to be able to effectively address some of those things that Maud talked about. What do you think are some of the things that are really important for the people that are supporting LGBTQ plus young people in terms of training, skills, knowledge? What are your thoughts?
Great. Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on this. I actually wanted to just sort of tie it back. I think that the use of language, terminology and concepts is quite a good vehicle to have a conversation I want to have, which is, I think we spend a lot of our time in our training sessions actually bringing people back to their centre, bringing people back to trusting their great skill and ability to engage and connect with young people. And it's that person-centred piece again that, often we're very good at engaging with young people, and then we can get derailed by stuff we hear in the media, stuff we hear from the government, stuff we're hearing in this report and that report, and we start to second guess ourselves and get nervous and think, are we allowed to do this? Should I do this? Will it feel like it's steering or influencing people? And we need to try and just put all that aside and come back to what we're really good at, because what I tend to say to people is, it's more important who you're being in the room than what you know. Really, really is. Now, look, we would all benefit from having a good degree of knowledge around LGBT plus issues and language, terminology and concepts. But as we've already identified from what was said by my colleagues earlier, that's changing all the time. So I think the energy needs to be put into the relationships we build with these young people. Now, I always say to people, you don't need to be an expert. You do not need to know all of the terminology. I certainly don't. And I've been working all sorts for 14 years and I lead training. I do not pretend. Saba will know some stuff I don't know. Maud will, we'll all know some stuff that each other don't know. I always say to people, keep interested and keep learning. As long as your head's in the game and you're really tuning in to what people are telling you, you're going to learn as you go what you need to know. So if a young person walks into with a particular identity and you don't think you've even heard of that before, don't panic, don't worry. There's already one expert in the room, by the way, and it ain't you. So trust that humans know what they need, they understand themselves, they will have done a load of research, and then it's about how you have that conversation often it's good to have some knowledge and be able to demonstrate you understand enough so that they can see you as an ally. Because I always say LGBT plus children and young people have got searchlights on. They're looking for who's safe, who can I trust. So if you introduce yourself with your pronouns, for example, bang, you're already in the room. They got you. You've already developed rapport. It's that, in a way, it's that simple. And then I would, I think we need to be confident about asking young people only the limits of our knowledge. I regularly at all sorts use to say, I'm really up for talking to you about this, but you're going to know way more about this than me, and I need to even check what that term means. Like for you, I want to know what it means in general. What does it mean for you? So it's actually just coming back to the basics of really good person-centered work, because we've got really caught up, because there is a lot of change in language, terminology, and concepts. So we spend quite a lot of our time bringing people back to that, reminding people of that. And then I say we give them the kind of basic building blocks and knowledge, to have enough language there. But also we spend a lot of time trying to develop empathy in people. If you understand what the issues people are facing, somebody mentioned heteronormativity earlier, people forget that. They sort of know it, but they let it drift away. So we bring things like that back to front and center and go, imagine how this is to go through this process and live in a world that's like this. And we'll do the basic building blocks of, what, assigned sex, gender identity, gender expression. I always say we need entry level. Not everybody needs to do a PhD in this, but you should all do entry level. And then you've already got one other expert in the room and it's not you.
Thank you. Thank you. There's some really clear messages in there that ties together some of the other points. And I think the two things that stuck out for me that I heard you say was about authenticity and being really present and true to who you are and what you know, and that being a good youth worker that centres the young person that you're engaging with first is the key. I think your message about not panicking is hugely important. There's a reason that we got so many people wanting to come and do this session. It's because people are really nervous and people are scared. And I think it's because often what you talked about is the noise. It's all the noise that comes into this space that makes people uncertain. But what I'm hearing from you is trust young people and trust yourself and trust your skills as a person-centered practitioner that focuses on young people, and don't let the noise distract you. Now, I guess people who are in this webinar are going to be thinking, but my organisation thinks this, or I don't know about this stuff. And I guess what you came back to on that was it's okay to not know, as long as you make the effort and the conscious effort to ask and engage and to just centre on what's important for that young person at the moment. If there was like, I don't know, if there was anything you talked about, you need entry level, you don't need PhD, which is a lovely turn of phrase. But what do you think would be the things that you would say as a youth work practitioner, if you're going to go and equip yourself with one bit of knowledge or one thing to read or one thing to do, what would you signpost? I mean, I know that's quite a tough question to say one, but what would you go with, do you think?
Well, I'd say book all sorts to do some training with you, obviously.
Of course.
Or Saba, or anyone else that delivers training. I mean, I don't know about one particular resource that I would say. I do, and I know I would say this as a trainer, but and I'm not just pitching for all sorts, Saba and other people. There's lots of places that deliver training, but I think it's best to get people in and have a conversation, because you can read a book, but then you're filtering it through what you already know. So I think being in a conversation with an experienced practitioner, whether that be a trainer or or a consultant or something, just we do training as little as an hour. I mean, if sometimes with schools we only get an hour, and I'd say I could give everybody everything they need to know in an hour in terms of just the basic content, because the main message is trust. It's back to that thing of trust yourself. It would be good to know what LGBT plus means. It would be good to know the distinction between sexual orientation and gender identity. People get those muddled up a bit still. We do a piece on an exercise that gets people down to the fact that, people don't have any choice, control, or agency over their sexual orientation and or gender identity. We believe that it's natural and innate, it is what it is. And I think that's a really important distinction, because people muddle up what we call the secondary choices, like coming out, exploring, labels and all of that. They confuse that with the thing itself. So, we do things around that. And then we just do the breakdown, the distinction between assigned sex, gender identity, gender expression. And then we get into some kind of, you know, we get into think about, we'll make assumptions, trying to unpick that a bit so people don't act on their assumptions, because we see people's gender expression, we make an assumption, we act on it, and we end up misgendering quite a lot of people. So then it's just coming back to, well, what are the things you could do differently? And it's depressingly simple, as use non-gendered language, and when appropriate in the context of, right, ask people about pronouns. I mean, there's nothing, I always say to people, there's nothing magical in what we deliver in our training. It's all, in a way, all really obvious stuff, but people just need to be brought back, have it put right in front of them, and go, oh yeah, I kind of know that. Yeah, you did know that. Why don't you turn the volume down on all of the stuff that's going on over there that's making you nervous, and just come back to that, what you know.
Yeah.
But I think having somebody in, I think doing it with, you know, with consultants and trainers and stuff is hugely valuable. And sometimes we don't need a lot of time to get there, to do it.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think what we hear all the time is that people get so overwhelmed by all of the noise that's out there that it's really hard to just come back to those points about trusting yourself, trusting young people, asking the right questions, equipping yourself with a bit of information. And I guess the other thing is, if you're in an organisation that has got the opportunity to have a budget for some training, amazing. There's some great places out there we've just talked about as examples. But also, I think I really tuned into the bit that you said about talking to people. There's lots of people in the country that are doing, you know, like yourselves, you know, that are doing really great work. And if your organisation can't afford to access training, then how can you equip yourself with some knowledge and understanding through talking to people who are doing really good work and sort of connecting in with other people to sort of create a more level playing field for young people?
Yeah, creating networks between different organisations. And again, probably there's a lot of experts already in your organisation. You're not paying them a wage, but they're there. They're your young people. They get youth focus groups. Ask, you know, you can't assume they'll necessarily want to do it, but most young people want to contribute to the increase in knowledge around these subjects, and will willingly create youth forums, youth groups, you know, to help educate people. There shouldn't be no assumption they would, but many will.
But Lucy's research evidence is that, right? You know, it's all been around sort of participatory action research and young people coming together to develop stuff. So I think you're right. As youth workers, we're really good at creating platforms for young people and making space for young people to lead and shape and guide. And perhaps it's coming back to some of that.
I just one last thing I did want to say, because I know what's underneath a lot of the fear, and we had, you know, those of us a bit older remember Section 28 and all of that, and it's all to do with this choice control agency. And just, I always remind everyone, particularly youth workers, you do not have the power or ability to influence anybody's sexual orientation and or gender identity, even if you tried. So it's absolutely appropriate to have these conversations. You're not steering or influencing people, you're giving them space to explore who they are. And I think people forget that, and we're still undermined all the time on that.
I think that's a really powerful message, because as youth workers, we might need reminding that we can't influence people's gender and sexuality and sexual orientation, but also as youth workers, we need to be empowered to have that conversation with other people. So when other people might be influencing your work or making you feel fearful or scared, it's worth just remembering that not only that you can be equipped with that knowledge and share it with parents and schools and carers. You, before I move on to Saba, you talked about Section 28 there, Ben, and I think it's really important and it's really relevant, particularly with things that are happening globally. But there might be lots of youth workers who don't remember what that is. So could you just give like a really whistle-stop tour of what that means and why it's important still?
Yeah, so it was a local authority. It was Section 28, so it was a clause, a sub-clause of a local authority act, and I can't remember the wording exactly, but paraphrasing roughly, it banned the promotion of homosexuality as an alternative lifestyle choice, and that local authority establishments should not promote homosexuality as an alternative lifestyle choice. In essence, what it meant was the message to youth workers, teachers, anyone in a local authority establishment, which most schools were in that era. It was brought in 1988. I won't mention the government at the time. You can Google it, but you can guess anyway. So the government at the time, and it was seemed in response to a book that came out with, I think it was Jenny Lives with Eric, and some to do with a girl who has two dads. And that was in London Education Authority were encouraging schools to read this because they were having more and more same-sex parents showing up in their schools. And as a complete knee-jerk reaction, the government at the time said, you can't talk to children about this at all. So they banned all discussion of LGBT plus issues, very much built on this erroneous idea that you can influence somebody's sexual orientation. Their fear was if you tell children about this and read them stories about it, they'll turn out gay. But there's something inherently homophobic in that fear anyway. But of course, it's absolute nonsense, because when I was at school, the prince met the princess and lived happily ever after over and over again, and I turned out gay. So I'm living proof that the books you read children don't influence their sexual orientation. So, but it did huge damage. It basically meant an entire generation. Mine, I joined secondary school in '88, had no access to any support, information or knowledge, bearing in mind we were pre-internet as well. So it did untold damage to an entire generation. I think there are many people not on the planet now as a result of Section 28. I really feel that strongly about it. And it wasn't repealed till 2003. So it's had and its legacy has lived on. I mean, we're 21 years past that, and I still feel it's in the atmosphere, particularly with older youth workers and teachers who were around at that time. And we must never go back to it. With anything that comes in that looks anything like that, and we've had a few attempts in recent years of bringing in, I call them Section 28 light, we must fight it, because it does huge damage.
Thank you.
That was quite short. I could do an hour on that on a soapbox. I did all right though. That was about 3 minutes.
It was very succinct, but really, really important. And thank you for sharing your personal connection to it as well as your professional one, because I think it's, you know, when we talk about these things in quite an abstract way, it's not always easy for people to really conceptualize what that actually meant for people and how it impacted on people's lives. So thank you for sharing your vulnerability in that space, actually. So Section 28 feels like it was a long time ago, but what you're talking about is actually it wasn't, and it still has legacy now. We see traces of it in things that are happening. There was all the stuff about drag story time last year and the year before, if people saw that, and various different things about PSHE in schools, which we're not going to go into now because of policy, because that's the thing that we said we weren't going to talk about, or one of. However, it's really important contextual information when we're working with young people and as workers, because understanding our own lived experience and our own biases and what we bring to the table when we're working with young people is key. We've heard about being authentic. I think one of the things that you started to talk about and that we've heard from everybody is that for a lot of young people who are questioning their gender or who are LGBTQ, they're living with extreme prejudice, homophobia, transphobia, discrimination and hate in the real world and also in the online world a lot. And it's really, really difficult and really, really hard for them. And we shouldn't underestimate that. And I think one of the things that I wanted to pick up on is that as workers working with young people who are experiencing extreme psychological harm sometimes as a result of some of this, that can be quite difficult. It can be quite difficult for youth workers. And we know that as a practice, we should all get really regular, robust supervision. But actually, that doesn't happen everywhere for financial reasons and various different things. So I guess for me, there's something about how do we look after ourselves as practitioners in order to show up in the best way possible for young people who are living with this harm? Saba, I'd quite like to bring you in here. What are your thoughts on sort of worker well-being?
Yeah, thanks, Abby, and thanks so much for asking this question and including something about well-being, because it's such an important part of our practice. You know, as me as a trans youth worker, I lead with my lived experience. I lead with my lived experience not just as a trans person, but as a person of color, as a Muslim. You know, all these intersections mean that I'm more permeable, I guess, to the experiences of the young people who also have that same lived experience. So I need to know myself to protect myself. I think we need to know what are these tender parts of ourselves before we go into that space, not to patch them up, but just to kind of hold hold ourselves a little bit further back and to make sure we have those spaces to debrief, to have, you know, supervision, reflection as well. But one thing that really impacted, you know, really highlighted the importance of worker well-being was, as you know, as Maud mentioned, was 2020 was the impact of that year of pandemics and well, so many different things. For us, what happened just after that was we had a death of a young person who I was personally very close to, which really changed like the very kind of fabric, the texture of my youth work practice. You know, suddenly we were working with grieving young people and grieving youth workers and a grieving community, and we had to suddenly embed grief into youth work practice. You know, we as youth workers had to feel empowered and well enough to have the conversations about grief with young people, as well as include that into some of the spaces that we hold for young people, depending on ages, of course. I'll flag here now, there is a free resource by the Kite Trust and Navigating the Wilderness on working with grief with LGBTQ young people, which I really recommend checking out. It's free, you can download it online. So with, you know, with grief, with lockdown, with all these, you know, various changes and setbacks to trans rights and healthcare, our work started to include not just grief but loss, like lots of different kinds of loss, and crisis, like not just being ready for some unexpected to happen, but actually expecting the unexpected. I remember having these conversations and thinking, oh, we're just going to have to work with crisis now, work with this kind of changing landscape. So what we did for that is we had a lot of time together as youth workers. So we set up spaces, online spaces, just to be together online. We didn't have an agenda. We were like, let's just find an hour in this day. It was paid time as well, so there wasn't a worry of like, this is taking away from my hours, or, you know, what's, you know, it was said to us that your time just to be and to react to this is valuable. So vent, be upset, be angry, you know. It was a space that just invited like all the responses and emotions that we are going to have as LGBTQ youth workers, but outside of youth spaces, so we could have our time and do what we needed to then be ready to support young people. It was so useful. I think we really needed it. You know, we're a community as well, and when we work on these intersections, and our identities are also on these intersections, we are a small number of people, and we have very unique experiences that are going to be very particular to us. In particular, I actually started suffering from vertigo quite suddenly in this same year, and I was really worried about what that would mean for me being able to practice youth work and do it safely. And, you know, I kind of had all those doubts, like, oh my gosh, like, am I just broken? Can I no longer do youth work? Is there something wrong with me? What have I not done to protect myself from this thing? And of course, it was the last 2, at the time, 2 years of so much stress and trauma and grief and loss. That meant that my body was telling me, you need to take a break. You need to sit down and sit very still for the next 20 minutes, Abba, or we're going to do it for you. And I did ask my colleagues. I said, I think I need to take some time off, like maybe a few weeks, maybe a month. And they were like, no, you need to take longer off. Like, you need to take, and not in a way like, whoa, like you're not okay, but in the most loving and caring way, which was like, that month is going to go by. You're not even going to have time to chill. So take, and we talked about it, and they were like, actually, why don't you take 6 months off from this period to this period? We can kind of write you out of work and out of services and meetings and stuff. So actually, let's really plan for you not being here, so you don't have to worry about the work. Young people are going to be okay. We'll have this covered, and you can just recover. And it was the best. It was the most like kind act I think I've ever received, and that was from my colleagues, people I work with. And I think my point is that it's so important that we look after each other. It wasn't yeah, just like having that kind of question now that I think is really embedded in a lot of my practice is like, I see a friend who's struggling or a colleague who's struggling, or something's happening in the news which I know is related to them because of, where, what their heritage is or their background. And I say, yeah, how are you doing today? And instead of me saying like, what do you need? Because I don't think it's an easy question to answer. I know young people hate that question. So I kind of say, well, what do you have on your plate? What's urgent? What do you need to do today? Can someone else do that? Can I do that? Or I just say, I can do that right now, like that email, let me send that. So then what will that take you, like an hour? So just wrap up at 3 o'clock, just sign off, and then let's check in tomorrow at 12 o'clock, have a bit of a slow morning, and let's just take it from there. So I think what the last 4 years of a world completely changing has given us is like the ability to really break apart the way that we do care, or what we think well-being looks like at work. I think we really need to be flexible and be kind of creative as well. Like I came back totally restored after 6 months and rejuvenated, and a different perspective as well of what well-being looks like, what I need to thrive, and what capacity I have to support my colleagues just like they did for me.
Thank you for similar to what I said to Ben. Your vulnerability in that and your honesty in that is not always an easy thing to share. So I really appreciate that. And I'm really sorry that you felt like that, but I'm really glad that you had caring and compassionate colleagues that were able to be alongside you and help you to kind of find a way through. And also, through the tragic loss of one of your young people, just awful. I think that the things that really stood out for me that you talked about was caring, compassion, and check-in, and that's checking in with yourself, but also checking in with other people around you. Not because we can't be our whole selves for young people if we can't look after ourselves in that. And I think you gave some really practical and useful things that we can do regardless of resources and regardless of all of those pressures that people can bring to the table. But the key word for me was about that care. It really has been a really strong message about caring for yourself in order to be, yes, absolutely, that we should stick that in the corner, about being able to really care, and about being able to check in on all of the people around us, because then we're able to bring a much better service for young people. I think when we're talking about care and compassion, it brings us nicely onto this notion of spaces and being comfortable, because actually in order to be able to respond well to care and compassion, you need to feel safe and held in that moment, whether it's with young people, whether it's with colleagues, whether it's about the environment that you're in. And so there's definitely a theme that I'm feeling through the things that you're talking about safety and about safe spaces, and about where we're able to and how we're able to do that work. It was picked up through the things that Maud was saying. It was picked up through through everything. And I guess one of the things that's jumped out for me is that if people aren't feeling comfortable, so if workers aren't feeling comfortable and ready, then we're not going to have a safer and braver environment in which young people can feel confident to explore stuff. If people are feeling a bit fearful and a bit anxious about some of the environmental noise that's happening and about the work they're doing. So I wonder if we can explore that a little bit about, how can we think about ways to create safer and braver workers and spaces. Lucy, I'm quite interested to hear your thoughts on this, because obviously you've done substantial work with young people, and yet probably don't consider yourself to be a youth worker. So what's been some of the learnings that you found about how we can sort of empower safer spaces and people?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned at the start that my research has been based in LGBTQ plus youth groups. So I maybe do have a kind of slightly unique experience, really, in perspective, in that I've done ethnography, participant observation, basically a kind of anthropological take where I sort of sit and hang out with young people and observe what's going on in in 6 different LGBTQ plus youth groups over the years, all with a very different setup, all with different access to resources, all with different particular kind of personal experiences and identities held by the youth workers. And I think that, you know, as an outsider who then is on the inside to have that perspective, what I've really learned is in terms of creating safe spaces for LGBTQ young people, it's much as Saba and Maud were talking about earlier, it's knowing that is a safe space. So not all of the groups that I worked with were necessarily staffed by LGBTQ plus people. Some of them, everyone was cis and straight and didn't have that personal experience, but everybody was able to create a space where the young people felt able to be themselves. You know, that is what you all do so incredibly and powerfully, is empower young people to feel able to be themselves. And so very much kind of, you know, drawing on what Ben was saying, the level of, it's not about being an expert, it's not about knowing all the terminology, it's not about even having that lived experience. It's about understanding how to create that space. And for young LGBTQ people, that is about a space to explore freely, away from judgment. It's about knowing that they're not going to be questioned, that they're not going to be challenged in any kind of an aggressive way, that they're going to be believed, I guess, in that space. And just one of the things that I saw that wasn't the case in all of the youth groups I worked with, but I did think it was really powerful in those that did use it, was kind of starting sessions with the opportunity for young people to share their name and their pronouns. Not kind of insisting on this, people didn't have to contribute if they didn't want to, but again, as Ben said, you know, as youth workers saying, you know, hi, my name's Lucy, my pronouns are she, her, by kind of normalizing that experience, that I guess what it does is it shows that this is a space where no one's going to assume what your gender identity is based on, you know, what you may or may not look like, or how your expression might be, or what clothes you're wearing. And what I thought was really important with that is what I saw over, you know, periods of several months at a time, was young people would come to the group each week, and their names and their pronouns might change in that time. And they might change kind of quite gradually, or they might actually change quite regularly. And that was difficult for some of the youth workers to keep track of, actually, you know, to make sure that they're using the names and pronouns young people wanted to be used. But the fact that they were creating that space, and the fact that they were accepting these changes without question, it just seemed so validating for the young people. And as I say, I've done these interviews with young people, and that's one of the things that they talked about, was just knowing that this was a space where they had the freedom to work things out and to express themselves freely. Saying that, I agree absolutely with what Ben was saying before, that there are certain things that it is really useful to know, you know, those distinctions between sex and gender, for example, and certain terminology. And again, that's why we've got the glossary. It's to try and empower people to kind of feel like they do have some of the basics that they're less sure on. But yeah, I also think it's about young people sort of being able to talk about their experiences and their feelings and their identities. Not that people are kind of asking intrusive questions. I think some questions are more appropriate than others, you know, asking questions, you know, asking what are your pronouns? Can I ask what your pronouns are? I think is a really useful thing to do as standard to create that inclusive environment. But there are some questions that would just be completely inappropriate and would actually shut down that environment. So, you know, we don't need to know the ins and outs of someone's, I don't know, desires or personal feelings necessarily. Youth workers know this better than I do, but I do think that creating a space for open dialogue is important as well.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. And I guess, like, we know that youth workers know this stuff, but I think it was Ben that talked earlier on about, we forget that we know this stuff is about good relationships, and it's about professional confidence and competence. And sometimes having that real strong reminder like the one that you just gave is really hugely valuable for people to trust themselves and trust in their work. I think that the really strong message that I heard in what you said was, you don't have to have lived experience in order to be able to do good work, but you have to be authentic and you have to be open, and that using professional curiosity but underpinned by kindness and compassion and care is key to being able to get, or for what you've observed, is key to be able to create some of these environments. So ask the right questions, but know why you're asking the questions and what the value is. And I think you gave the example of a youth group where people were given the opportunity to check in with names and pronouns. And I remember working with a colleague, in fact, it was a project in Bromsgrove. It was an LGBTQ project in Bromsgrove, and they ran a specific youth group for young people, or it was labelled as something for young people who identified as part of LGBTQ plus community. But they didn't ever ask anybody whether they had that, wore a label in that group to attend. What they did was, everybody that came in, as people came in, they said to them, just so you know, this is an LGBTQ plus safe environment. Is that okay for you? And so people had to people almost had the opportunity to check out before they came in. So it wasn't about asking, are you, do you, what are you, how do you, what do you identify as, what do you feel? It was, this is a safe space for everybody with a specific focus here, and it's up to you. And I think those kind of examples that just operate from being inclusive rather than exclusive really change the heteronormative approach to things that we have. So yeah, that's another really useful example of where we can kind of flip reality and make really inclusive spaces. I think something that we hear a lot is that some spaces are easier to operate in than others, physical spaces. So you said, oh, youth workers know how to do this stuff, and we do, but sometimes as youth workers, we are operating in different environments, schools, prisons, you know, a local park, online, in hospitals. You know, youth work is everywhere, and that can bring different challenges when we're trying to do what we believe to be really good, inclusive youth work. And we might be constrained by different constructs. So Ben, I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this and safe spaces, because I know that All Sorts has done quite a lot of work alongside and within schools, which is often quite a tricky environment.
Yeah, it can be, yeah. I just want to reference back to something I think Saba said quite early on, and I don't know whether you brought this to All Sorts, Saba, or not, but I like the idea of safer rather than safe, because I think we can never guarantee any space is safe, but safer is definitely something we talk about, and more inclusive spaces. I think one thing to remember, I mean, because youth work is so different. Some people might be doing detached youth work, you might be out there on your own, and I always try and remind people, whatever environment you're in, you could be working in a prison, in a school that's not very supportive or inclusive. You can be the safe space. A relationship is a safer space or not, and that's really down to you. You make that a safe, inclusive space or not, and no one can ever touch that. Whatever environment might be going on around you, you have that, and you can make that or not. That is within your gift to make that or not. So I think, I mean, we do quite a lot of work with schools to varying degrees of willing and game and up for it. We kind of need to do this, we have to do this, or we should do this. So I think when you're doing, I would encourage anybody who's on this call, if you've got any opportunity in a school or in an organisation, to have a conversation about looking at creating an LGBT plus group within that wider organisation. I always think it's a good idea to. It's going to form naturally anyway. If you go through any school, you see these groups of kids, you know, not just LGBT plus. People are drawn towards people that are more like them. So it's kind of like, it could be happening in a corridor anyway. but actually sometimes it's really good to take it into a slightly more structured space, because I think in doing that, you can sometimes reach some of the harder to reach young people who might not want to approach that group in a corridor, but might come to a designated room where there's going to be this group. I think we should never underestimate the power of doing that in spaces where parental consent isn't needed, because there are lots of young people who can't come to all sorts for a whole host of reasons. They don't have consent, they don't have parental buy-in, they're too scared to, but they will go to a group in school because they can. It's just their lunchtime thing and they're doing it. So I think they're incredibly important in certainly schools, because they're big organizations, but any reasonable size organization that might be running more generic services and youth groups. I always think, for me, it's about, if you're running a wider service, and sometimes people say, but LGBT is not our primary focus. Yeah, I got it. How many LGBT plus people are coming through your doors? And see how many more come through if you create an LGBT group, and then that's a gateway in, and then you might open them up into the wider service. So I'm personally, I think there's a space for it. It's not always the primary issue, but it is a way of creating a gate in. I always use the example when I first moved to Brighton, I went to the Buddhist centre, and they said to me, I was reasonably out, and they said, we don't get any gay men ever come to our centre. I'm like, yeah, they have a view about you. They see you as religion, and they have a view about that. And so I said, why don't you run a gay men's meditation group and see what happens? 35 men turned up, and we did a study. About 20 or so of them were still involved a year later, and some went on to get ordained into the Western Buddhist order. So you create a gateway in, people might access the wider service. So, and I think it's just thinking really carefully about how you set those up. I mean, again, there's lots that could be said on that. There probably are some really good resources out there. I'm terrible pointing people to resources, but I'm sure we can find some. But just thinking very carefully about how you set that up, the groups. We often, like, I think it was to your point, I think it was you, Abby, saying that we often say it's LGBT plus allies, because in a way, some people aren't ready to say they're LGBT plus, so they could just be there as an ally. We don't know what their agenda is, why they're there, but as long as they sign up to that, this is an inclusive space, and if they behave as though they are in that space in that way, then great, so be it. I'll probably stop there because I'm mindful of time.
Thank you, Ben.
Yes.
I think the thing that really struck me was about creating spaces that really call people in. I think something that had never crossed my mind was the fact that if you're doing it in an environment that young people are already in, it might make it easier and more accessible for young people to access it. That's something that I think is really, really powerful. I think there was something interesting there that we've not had a lot of time to touch on, but or we've started to, but about sort of intersectional identities, and your example about sort of faith and sex and gender and sexuality and perceptions in relation to sort of the Buddhist philosophy was a really interesting one. I definitely feel like there's space for a whole additional activity on this, because we've had lots and lots of feedback and questions coming into the group about things like, but what about young people who are, for example, on the SEND register or are neurodiverse and questioning their gender and questioning their sexuality, or young people with different types of abilities and disabilities and race and faith. And so there's definitely, I think it feels like people are almost additionally concerned about how to manage intersectionality in relation to this space. Before I come to Maud around some stuff around digital, Saba, have you got anything that you would like to contribute there that would be really useful? And I think Ben has too.
Yeah, is that just around the intersectionality in particular? Sorry.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Gosh, I mean, it feels like quite a big topic. I mean, I think for me, it's what I was thinking about is kind of what we started talking about, which is kind of knowing yourself and understanding yourself as like as someone with intersections of identity and lived experience, in the sense that can help you then position yourself in relation to other young people. Like something I was thinking earlier was just about, I feel like people can forget that it's not just LGBTQ people who have pronouns or who have sexualities or gender identities, and actually everyone on this call will. So actually, what can learning about your own gender identity, your racialized identity, your religion, your faith, your spirituality teach you about yourself, but also how you support young people, how you relate to others as well, and really having the space to explore that. Yeah, I hope that that was what you had in mind.
Yeah, I think so. I think people become overly fearful because they try and what the feedback that we get is people try and categorize, and they're like, oh well, it's, you know, superimpose different assets or different facets of people's identity onto a particular group that they might feel less comfortable in their knowledge about. And I guess what I hear you say is that we all have intersections of identity, and perhaps being able to be more authentic and understand ourselves will help us understand how to sit alongside young people with their intersectional experiences and identity and social constructs. Is that the right summary?
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that we then say like, oh well, this is my identity and that's how it's different, or it's just like it these things about ourselves can just kind of very kind of quietly influence then how we lead that practice. Do I say at the start, actually, I don't know what this means. I don't know what this means for you, or like, I know what you're talking about, but this is what it means to me. So can you tell me? It's how we allow that to direct then our practice with that young person and identify gaps. Okay, so I feel really nervous about talking about being trans in this trans space. Actually, even though I can relate a lot, I actually do a lot of work on my own self. There's it's use ourselves as a tool in that way.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that the other part that I heard you say was it's about using and knowing ourselves, but also coming back to we're person-centered. So it's about that person, their experience, and just because being a white working class woman and mother means these things to me doesn't mean that it means the same to this person who on the face of it might have the same labels, but actually could have a very different lived experience and reality as a result of those intersections. The person-centered, keeping that central construct of being about the people. Thank you. Maud, the online space is something that is increasingly important and prevalent in many young people's lives. And throughout this session, we've heard lots of different things about it being harmful, but also incredibly helpful and intrinsic. I wondered whether you could just give us a few thoughts about the online environment in relation to supporting and working with LGBTQ young people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it can be quite hard thinking about using online as a resource because it can often feel like there's a bit of a disconnect and a barrier, especially when, as a youth worker, you're trying to support someone online. It can feel like, if you say you're in a video call like this, you can feel like there's a bit of a barrier making that connection and building that trust with the young person. And we found, a lot of young people actually prefer sort of in-person youth groups and stuff. But I think trying to look at the online space as a positive tool that you can use is helpful, because a lot of the times, you can't assume the young person's needs that you're working with. And it's not a one approach fits all. There's a lot of young people, like you were saying earlier, that actually are, SEND and neurodiverse, actually have a lot of barriers that we may not be aware of or even think about because it's not something we experience in our own lives. So, we have some young people, we've got one of our youth workers works with someone online in a video call, and they don't want to put their camera on, they don't want to put their mic on because they have that anxiety. So the youth worker, will type to them and say, are you comfortable with me leaving my camera on so you can see me and I can type to you? And they ended up having an hour-long session where they're actually typing back and forth about their feelings. And that worked for that young person because they could remain anonymous and they felt comfortable opening up in that way. So I think, being able to look at online space as a tool for some people, I mean, it doesn't work for everyone, but there's definitely, it's a useful option for some people that they do need it. And I think just whatever space you're in, just making it a safe space, yeah, it's just so important. I mean, like Ben was saying about it's not what you know, it's who you are in that space is so important. And we've been talking about authenticity. I think also like, transparency is really important. So, you know, as a youth worker, I'm a cisgender bisexual woman, but I don't have lived experience with gender identity. So I make sure that when I'm talking to, you know, the youth that I'm working with that are experiencing stuff with their gender identity, that I say, I am constantly learning and developing myself. I'm not an expert. And if there's anything in a session that you are like, oh, hang on a minute, I don't actually really like how you've worded that, or the words you've used there, or something, to call me out on it, and I'll change it so that the space is safe and comfortable for you. And that's what I'm here to do. So sort of having that transparency that, yeah, you're not an expert and the individual is the expert of their experience. And yeah, I just wanted to touch on quickly about what Saba said about sort of incorporating grief into youth work. You know, at BU we do a lot of training, and it's really important to do obviously LGBTQ plus training. I'm sure sort of everyone does, and that's really beneficial. I think it's also important to do sort of wider training, like trauma-informed approach and therapeutic care, therapeutic approach, those sorts of training in your youth work as well. Just to give you sort of a bigger like toolkit in a way on how to approach your work with young people is, yeah, really important.
Thank you, Maud. I think that's really valuable, because what it does is it kind of brings together everything that's been the flow of the conversation all the way through. We've talked about so many different facets, but ultimately the key message that's come from everybody's work is that if we're to truly support young people with a multifaceted identities, whether it's around gender, identity, whatever, sexuality, the key is to have as broad a toolkit as we can possibly have, both through recognising our own, what we bring to the table and being authentic to ourselves, but also accessing any sort of resources that we might have, so different types of training, but also networks of other professionals, but ultimately bringing it to what's needed by that young person or those young people in the room at the time, and using all of our toolkits and everything that's available to us to bring our whole self, but to support young people in a person-centred way. We've almost run out of time, as we always do, and I think it's really important to just acknowledge and thank all of you for giving up the time to be here today. This is often a topic that people are really uncomfortable with. People have quite strong polarizing views on how we should best support young people, particularly around gender identity and sexuality, which is often quite problematic. And I think to be able to bring people such as yourselves, who've got such a breadth of experience and knowledge and expertise to the space, and make yourselves available for youth workers is incredibly generous. And I'm really, really thankful to you for giving up your time to be with us today. We followed up, thank you, Saba. We followed up most of the questions as we've gone on. That there was a couple that kind of came in alongside around stuff like peer pressure, that I think is probably a conversation for another time. But I'm just really grateful to you all for being here.